Welcome to the EdRed Podcast, a podcast discussing important issues impacting Illinois public education and the action being taken to address them. Each month, a new episode will be released featuring education experts.
The EdRed Podcast is co-hosted by Bridget Peach and Arabette Hernandez of EdRed. Disclaimer: this episode of the EdRed Podcast was recorded in December of 2023, and therefore it does not address the most recent initiatives regarding the literacy program. Additionally, Sarah Miller is now a part of the Illinois Association of School Boards team, and although she is no longer with EdRed, we are still able to collaborate with her on legislative matters.
So welcome to our early literacy episode with Sarah Miller. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to kick us off, please introduce yourself, give us, some details on your role with EdRed and how the organization got involved with the early literacy conversation.
Of course, yes. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited that you're doing this. I think it's such a cool idea. But I am Sarah Miller. So I've worked with EdRed as a policy consultant for about 10 years. And over that time, we've just worked on all kinds of issues, legislative issues like zoning, finance, teacher tenure, transportation, but also a lot of student issues like dual credit access, student discipline, and then for the past couple of years, early literacy. So early literacy really came legislatively, it came to the forefront back in 2020. And just to give you some context, back in the summer of 2020, there were a lot of protests following the death of George Floyd. So those all took place kind of in the summer of 2020, and in the late summer, fall of 2020, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus got together and they really put together these 4 pillars. And the 4 pillars really represented areas that they really felt needed to be addressed legislatively, policy-wise. And so they got together and put together these pillars and discussed legislation that needed to be forwarded in each of those areas. So those 4 areas were, there was a pillar for criminal justice reform, there was a pillar for economic access, equity, and opportunity, there was one for healthcare and human services, and then the 4th one was education and workforce development. So all of these pillars, they met a lot and came up with these big omnibus bills for all 4 of those pillars. So as it relates to education, there were all kinds of things in that bill, including codifying the kids' assessment. That's where the 2 years of foreign language in high school came about. There was funding for community schools, anti-racist investment funding. But in the original bill, there was one piece that really included literacy reforms. And so what was originally introduced in that bill was it mandated that every single school district had to complete universal screeners for all first graders and all second graders in both literacy and math. And then if that universal screener, there were 7 different areas you had to screen in. And if any of those screeners showed that kids were at risk for dyslexia, in at least the literacy area, then additional screeners would be required for those students. And then it went on to say what kind of interventions and supports were required for those kids. So that was put in the original bill. All of these legislative pillars were introduced in January of 2021. And as it relates to at least the early literacy portion of the education reform bill, there were a lot of concerns voiced from multiple stakeholders, including school management, including teachers. Just a lot of people were really concerned, and some of the concerns really arose from, it was just this concern to not over-identify students, that if you're doing these screeners at a really young age and you're using that as just the sole indicator that these kids need additional supports, you could be over-identifying kids. There was also a lot of discussion that districts had RTI and MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support, in place. And so it was, confusion as to whether this was a new system, how could this be embedded into the current system? So ultimately what happened in January 2021 is that piece was removed. I think, as we know, some of the other pieces will move forward, but the whole literacy reform piece was taken out of that omnibus bill, and there was a commitment to further conversations on that. So I know that's some context, but the main question was, how did EdRed get involved? And so a couple months later, Jessica Handy, who works with STAND, she was a very part of those conversations. And I believe, I didn't check with her, I think she was involved in the drafting of that literacy portion, or had at least worked on it. So she actually reached out to Ed Red. She had just following that being taken out of the bill. She was really passionate about literacy, and her group really wanted to take that issue on. But she formed this early literacy coalition. And one of the people in that early literacy coalition was actually an Ed Red board member who had worked extensively with her district and her district superintendent to really address literacy efforts in their district, and really felt that they had made some great strides. So she actually had suggested to Jessica, hey, reach out to Ed Red, which was great. And so when they reached out to us, I know Sarah Hartwick was the executive director at that time, and we had worked with Jessica on some other things. And, we said, hey, Ed Red has amazing school districts. We're doing amazing things. Yes, we would like to meet. And so that's what we did. We put out a call to Ed Red members saying, hey, who's interested in having this conversation? And we got a lot of responses. So we had a good group of people that met over that summer. What we started by doing is just kind of taking the legislation that was introduced and having Jessica really talk through her thought process in why did you introduce it? What are the issues that you're trying to identify? And why did you pick these, particular solutions? So really good dialogue with her. And then at that point, a lot of our districts shared, hey, this is like what we're doing at the district level to address these issues. So we called it, I think it was the Ed Red Early Literacy Ad Hoc Committee. Really beautiful title, but yes, that's it. That's really what we did. So yeah, it started out just as, hey, we know literacy can be improved. We know it's an issue. We know it impacts equity. What can we do about it?
Like you said, so the Edward districts have been a part of the conversation early on. It was called the Early Literacy Ad Hoc Committee, correct? I guess, can you share what our member districts were doing or are currently doing to move this issue forward?
Yeah, I mean, so to go back to those conversations in 2021, I mean, what they really did is like shared, hey, this is what we're doing, but hey, here's some of the challenges that we have as well. It's kind of a balance, because I think what we really learned is every district was in a different stage of their literacy journey, and they were all doing different things. So I think it was really beneficial, at least I mean, the impression I got was it was really beneficial for them to come in as either literacy specialists or assistant principals that were working on this issue and kind of share ideas and just learn from each other. So some of the things that they kind of shared that they were doing was with new materials, there's costs associated with that. They need additional supports. There really was, the one thing that really stood out is they shared that there was a lack of resources and guidance in what they should be doing, that they had all these kind of companies coming at them, but how do you sort through all of that noise and really find out what's best for students? So really having those conversations was the first part of it. And we did talk about the assessment piece. And again, there were a lot of concerns with really over identifying kids and really focusing on strengthening the MTSS system. So I think one of the biggest things that we did, and I actually just looked at this document again, is we created this, it's called the guiding principles. So we worked on that draft, kind of put a draft together, edited it, and then sent it to the EdRed board. And what I found was really valuable about that document is, through those conversations with Jessica, we knew she was going to introduce something legislatively, but we didn't really know exactly what it was going to be. And so we didn't really want to put the board or, ourselves in a box when it came to this. We wanted to have conversations and continue to learn. So that guiding principle document was just meant to be guidance and fluid. And I would say we really, looking back at it now, like we really stuck to those principles. So I would just say in terms of advocacy, it's so important to hear those administrative and school board member voices, because there's so many things that I pulled on personally when talking about legislation and moving forward. So yeah, that guiding principles document, it dealt with higher ed coursework, universal screeners and testing, curriculum, interventions, funding needs. Yeah, and so it's really was helpful in forming legislative process for us. But the other great thing that that committee did, at least during 2022, is, and I think we continue to meet with them, Bridget, you and I, when the Right to Read Act was actually filed, and Jessica did help quite a bit in drafting that. So that was originally filed in 2022. Every time a new amendment came out, we'd pull our ad hoc committee together, put together just kind of like, here's the main things that have changed. How do we feel about this? And it was just, yeah, it was just so helpful to have those people implementing literacy efforts to give us feedback, and then we could bring that back to the legislators and the other stakeholders that were trying to move this forward.
I think that's one of the structures within the organization that works really well. Having these focus groups, ad hoc committees, we could call them whatever, but having these groups of practitioners who are going to implement what is coming from the state, that directs so much of what we do. And this is a perfect example of how that really succeeded, of keeping everyone posted. I know that when ISB had their symposium, we immediately had this group that we were able to pull from for sending attendees. Can you speak to some of the proposals that may have been a bit more controversial that came through the state? I know that, like any legislative proposal, stakeholders come and go. And I know that one of the big turning points that I felt was once the English learners focus area in terms of student populations. That was something that I think turned those negotiations in a different direction. I'd love for you to speak to English learners and the Latino Policy Forum coming in and doing some advocacy for them, but also any of the other, and controversial is kind of a strong word, but some of the more less than ideal or extreme legislative proposals.
Yeah, well, like I said, Jessica introduced in 2022, the Right to Read Act, and there were a lot of pieces of that that we really agreed with, but there were some pieces that we were concerned about. I think one that was, I mean, it wasn't less of an issue for us, but one of the components of that, and we had heard from administrators and school board members that one of the frustrations is that they get new teachers and they hadn't been well prepped in early literacy and how to teach reading to these kids. And so I think a big focus of that bill was the prep programs. And so what the original bill actually required was an additional teacher test. So once they graduated from college, before they could get licensed, there would be an additional test. I think there was an equity issue that was trying to be addressed there, that every student should have access to a teacher that had a certain foundation of skill level to teach reading. But I think unfortunately we're in this teacher shortage crisis, and there's actually legislatively been, a counter move to take away some of those licensure tests. So I think that was really challenging. But what was really interesting in talking to Jessica about that is that the Illinois standards for those test programs were actually really good. And so what they were trying to solve is, how do you make sure that the teacher prep programs were actually teaching what the standards say they should teach? So there was a lot of conversation around that, but that was one of the more controversial pieces of that original proposal. The other controversial piece, at least in 2022, there was some language. I mean, overall, it was really trying to push ISB to create more guidance, take more of a leadership role in literacy, which we really supported. But there was also a push to really mandate certain types of curriculum, where ISB would actually be picking curriculum that districts could choose from. And that we had really serious concerns with, because that's always been a local control issue. I mean, we absolutely supported ISB developing a rubric, developing tools to help guide districts, and our districts were actively asking for that. Like, tell us what we should be doing. But yeah, I mean, I think some of those curriculums, when you really dive into that literacy conversation, are more controversial than others. But we really wanted to make sure that we had the guidance that we needed to pick our own curriculum. So that was really important to us. I think, this is getting into another, but I mean, I do want to talk also about the summit that you mentioned, Bridget, because that was great that ISB took that on and put it together. When that bill was introduced in 2022, it was kind of like, as you said, the EL groups really came out and said, hey, we don't want to we don't want to negatively impact EL students. We really want, dual language learners to be respected. We want to make sure that we're doing what we can in other languages, that we're really supporting their language development in their native language to the extent we can, but being sensitive to the fact that, it takes time to develop some of those issues when you've been speaking one language in your household and now you're transitioning to a different language. So that was a really good turning point for the group. And when ISB said, let's put on the brakes, we're going to hold the summit. I mean, we had all kinds of representatives attend on EdRed's behalf, and there were all kinds of breakout sessions that addressed these types of things, panel discussions. That really did come out of the Right to Read Act. But I did kind of want to touch too, because where this kind of gets a little bit confusing is, so we had that original bill that dealt with universal assessments that transitioned into this like Right to Read Act, this different pathway. And so after that summit, Jessica did reintroduce the Right to Read Act that had many of the same components, but tweaking it. But then what also happened in the spring of 2023 was a new version of that original bill that I discussed earlier, which had the universal assessments. So that kind of came back into the picture. And it was a group of parents of dyslexic students that really cared about that issue. And so I think what was controversial about that piece is they were really starting to push for universal screeners again. It was a little bit different than what was introduced in 2020, but it was still requiring universal screeners for every kindergarten, first and second grade student, and then these secondary screeners. And from our perspective, dyslexia is a really big component of literacy. And I know that there's specific guidelines that ISB has created for dyslexia. And I don't think I mentioned either that as part of the conversation with Right to Read, one of the new components of that was creating the statewide literacy plan. And ISB had already agreed to that. And so they were on board. So we knew that was going to happen. So we were kind of entering into the space where not a formal task force, but a working group would be put together. And we were really concerned about passing something very specific about screeners that really should be addressed as part of that big comprehensive plan. So I think the timing of that was really concerning. And as you said, with the EL students, what we heard over and over from our people is there's so many reasons in kindergarten you might not pass a screener. I mean, one of it would be EL, you're an EL student, just haven't had exposure to that language yet. Some kids just haven't had the rich literacy experiences that other kids have. And then once they're exposed to that in kindergarten, first grade, then it's going to be less of an issue. But I think, and something that was really emphasized as well as that summit when we did the national perspective is you don't want to over-identify kids as special education students through these screeners. So those were kind of the more controversial pieces that we really had to work through. To kind of tell you what passed was Representative Mussman did actually pull back on that bill with the universal screeners and said, hey, let's let the process play out. So that bill kind of was put on hold for the time being. But one of the things that did pass were, yes, there is going to be a comprehensive early literacy plan, and that needs to come out by January 31st, 2024. ISB is creating resources, rubrics, professional development opportunities, and they have some really cool ideas of things that they want to do to bring this to school districts, some funding for certain pilot programs. They did take out the curriculum piece, so ISB will be giving a rubric, but not dictating curriculum. And then a lot of work was really done on the teacher prep program. And I will give Jessica and the higher ed institutions a lot of credit. They really tried to come together and come up with some ideas. Where they landed with that is that there will be a kind of a readings foundation test, but it won't be a condition of getting your licensure. But it will be kind of a check on the programs that they are teaching those things, just so you could see your teachers coming out of different universities. Are their programs aligning with what teachers need to know? So I think that is subject to appropriations as well, because one of the equity issues with the teacher programs is putting an additional financial burden on some teachers as a condition of actually going and getting the job. So there was a lot of work done there. So I think a lot of the controversial pieces were at least put on hold pending this literacy plan, and others were there was a compromise solution that was found.
So you kind of talked about this a little bit. All of our school districts, their community looks different, right? Including the EL learners that they have. So let's talk local control. How does local control factor into early literacy?
I think local control is really important as to how each district approaches literacy. And I think that really came to mind when I was reading through the drafts of the plan, because you have some bigger districts that might be able to have literacy specialists, that might have an assistant superintendent or, someone specializing in certain areas. But then if you've had smaller districts, you might not have the ability to have certain positions. So I think, how certain responsibilities are allocated is a really big piece of that. But you have different unique, student populations that you need to consider, how you're going to allocate the resources. And again, you have these systems that districts have been working on and improving and putting in place, these MTSS systems that have been adapted to those student populations that you really want to work within. And so I think it's just really hard to do a one size fits all model for literacy. So, there should be supports, there should be resources, but I think it's really, yeah, I mean, it's just really challenging to say that every school district should be doing this. So that was one thing that we heard consistently from the ad hoc committee, from our districts, from the ed red districts, that local control is really important. And then the final thing, like they're all in different stages of that journey. And I think one of the things that I love about ed red is like wherever you are, let's just commit to moving forward. Like let's not judge people for, not realizing this, but just let's, wherever you are, let's take what we have and the resources that ISB's committed to bringing to districts and use it to benefit students.
So I guess next steps, see the final version of that comprehensive state literacy plan at the end of January. And I think that will really dictate what we see the legislature do. If they're going to decide that the plan didn't go far enough, or if they're happy with it. Obviously, that piece about funding is going to be a big question for us. But in the meantime, what are some of the next steps that you would see coming up the road for the early literacy subject?
Yeah, I think, well, like you said, the plan comes out in January and ISB has to do all kinds of things as part of that. Well, they have the plan that comes out, but then in addition to the plan, they are creating resources. They are going to be creating guidance. So I can't speak to the patience of other stakeholders in, hey, let's let that process play out, or let's let districts read through the plan, take steps on their own to really build that out. I mean, I guess I will say though, is, at least at the joint annual conference, I know literacy was like one of the most well-attended sessions. Every time ISB released a draft, they held 6 listening tours, and those were really well attended by a lot of people. And so I think they have been very, very clear that this is guidance, that they can't mandate anything with this guidance document. But I guess I would say, like, one of the things I appreciate about in talking with Jessica is that I think the approach that they were really trying to take was less of a mandate approach and just kind of a groundswell of interest and, working together to forward this issue. So, I mean, I think it remains to be seen. Like, is this document really going to be the impetus for that? But you're right, Bridget. I mean, is there going to be an immediate reaction of this isn't far enough, or I don't know, maybe they went too far. We don't know what's going to be in that final document. So I think just kind of waiting to see what that document says. But yeah, I'm not sure if there's going to be other legislative proposals that come out of it. I mean, they could possibly have recommendations that are turned into legislative proposals, but we just kind of have to wait and see. But I think this was definitely a really good first step. And I will say, just anecdotally, I have heard that ISB has really been really taking, I mean, obviously they're taking it seriously, but just a lot of people, I know Jen Kermy spoke at the EdRed dinner last year on this issue. There was kind of, I think a lot of districts were really surprised that we didn't have something like this in place already. And this has been a massive undertaking. And so I think, we really did feel that that was the important first step to have a statewide approach. And then the districts could start implementing some of those recommendations and guidance that the state board had put together for them.
Closing thoughts, advice for members or legislators regarding how we handle or speak about early literacy as we move forward?
I think the one thing that I would say about this is that I hear all the time when this conversation first started coming is people were like, oh no, this is going to be the reading wars all over again, that it happened over a decade ago. And I think two of the most polarizing words that I have observed are science of reading and balanced literacy. It's like, and I think what I've been so surprised by is that everyone has these different understandings of what those are. I think for some people, balanced literacy is just, guess what the word is. And, other people say, no, you're still teaching foundations of learning, you're still teaching phonics, but you're also balancing that with comprehension and fluency and writing and speaking and all of those things. And I think some people see the science of reading as you're only teaching phonics, you're only teaching foundations, you don't care at all about the comprehension. But then other people say, no, that's not the case at all. So the one thing that I really hope that we continue to do is be positive and productive about where we're going. I don't think when you look at some of the statistics that, 40% of the students aren't reading at a proficient level. And, when you dig deeper into the issue, like which kids aren't reading at a proficient level, I think there is an equity issue there. And so I don't think it's a question of ignoring those things. I think you have to take those on. But I think one of the things that we learned from No Child Left Behind is like just blame and like just punishing and all of that doesn't get districts anywhere either. And so I do like the approach of, hey, let's move this forward. And as you hear from everyone, you're teaching people that go into the teaching profession and into the administrative profession and school boards, like they all want to help kids. And so I think that process of coming to terms with the fact that the way you've been teaching for 1, 2, 3 decades hasn't necessarily been benefiting all kids is a hard thing. And so that just takes time and it takes professional development. And so doing it in a really sensitive and proactive way is really important. I think, it's even interesting because ISB had a statement in its second draft that I believe it was the second, maybe it was the first, that they weren't going to use the term science of reading. And I know in the second draft, the word balanced literacy was very controversial. And so I think they're walking a very fine line and doing the best that they can. But so I guess my piece of advice was not to let those words be polarizing and just kind of focus on doing what's best for students. I think that's the one thing that just keeps reemerging over and over again.
What a great way to end the conversation with the reason why we're all doing this, which is for students. And thank you for addressing some of those catchphrases, also some of the data points that have been thrown out there in a very accusatory way, and how we can move forward and all get on the bus and move forward. So thank you again for joining us. It was great hearing all the work that you, along with the rest of the EdRed membership, has done in this space.